Okay, hey everybody, thank you very much for coming today. This is a presentation that we are doing on implicit bias, and we're going to be focusing specifically on implicit bias and how it fits into the judicial system. I will be covering a multitude of areas around implicit bias, more a little bit in some generalities in some areas, but we will be getting into some specifics about how to control specific bias in the courtroom. Before every presentation that I do, I always like to provide a brief introduction for myself. Part of the reason for the introduction for tonight is that there are research elements within which this introduction is designed that are very applicable to what a judicial system can use in order to help combat implicit bias within their jury pool. So again, thank you very much for coming, and welcome to my story. My name is Peter Weinberg. I'm Jewish, and my family comes from Sicily, which we all know gets the boot from Italy. I'm 49, I'm born in the month of October, and I'm a Libra. I did my undergraduate work at Green Mountain College in Vermont, which is known as the Green Mountain State. My PhD work was done at Saybrook University in San Francisco, California, which we all know is most famous for sourdough bread. And most importantly, San Francisco is my hometown. For about 20 years, I was a treating professional in psychology, which is very different than psychiatry, where they treat mental illness with medication, while I worked with people. I married my lovely wife, Lisa, at home in Denver, Colorado, the Square State. We live with our dog, Tigger, named after the bouncing tiger from the Winnie the Pooh children's stories. At home, I like to watch the San Francisco Giants, eat turkey on sourdough sandwiches, drink my favorite beer, 1554, which is brewed by New Belgium Brewing Company right up in Fort Collins, Colorado. I love to watch Westerns because they are iconic stories about people. My life experiences, my education, and my work experience prompted me to found my trial consulting firm, Litigare, where I try to incorporate the teachings of my heroes into my everyday life and work. If you just excuse me for a second, I'm going to have to shut off the monitor so it doesn't kind of detract from the presentation. Thank you for that. You know, with all the modern technology we have, I don't have one to turn off the TV screen. Implicit bias is one of these fascinating subjects that as psychological and social sciences have advanced, the legal system has become more and more aware of sort of the plight. I'm not sure the plight's the right word, but sometimes it does feel like a plight. Of how implicit bias plays in the way that juries make decisions. So what we're going to talk about tonight is we're first going to go over some general elements about implicit bias. We're going to go over the psychology behind it, and then we're going to be able to look at some concrete, research-based, practical applications that a judicial system can use to help to control for and educate potential jurors about implicit bias. Now, a quick brief remark about my opening. As I talked about, it is based on a series of peer-reviewed research, and that concept is referred to as learn, retain, and transfer. And I will be diving much deeper into that when we move down into the solution section of the presentation, because that bit of research plays directly into what a judicial system can do based upon some of the other peer-reviewed research on implicit bias. So, I'm a big fan of Socrates, and one of the things that Socrates always did before he would have any conversation is that he would sit down with the people that he was going to talk with and define terms. And when it comes to implicit bias, it's another area where it's going to be very important to ensure that we have a very clear definition and a very clear understanding of what it is that we're trying to deal with and cope with in the court system. So I am going to read this definition just to make sure that I get the content perfectly correct. So implicit bias refers to an unconscious and relatively automatic process of prejudiced judgment that subsequently can alter social behavior. Now, I know that that's a kind of strict, fancy psychological definition, so I think what I'd like to do is just take a moment and break that down a little bit through an example. And in this example, we're going to be introduced to an individual named Ralph, who potentially might pop up here and there again through our presentation. So Ralph, who's hypothetical, is a team leader of a large corporation. And Ralph really believes in gender equality. And as a supervisor of a team, he made it a priority to ensure that he would have an equal balance between men and women on his team. And he feels very proud of that. He very much likes this idea that this is what he's doing in the corporate world to try and create this even balance. Now, they have to have weekly meetings, and during the weekly meetings, what happens is that every single time a woman speaks, Ralph cuts her off and allows for a man to then speak up. And systemically, he allows women a shorter period of time than he does allow men to speak. So when we think about our definition of implicit bias, what we're seeing from Ralph is two things. First is that he has a general internal bias against women. Secondly, he has an internal bias that men are smarter and better problem solvers than women. Now, Ralph doesn't realize that he cuts the women off during his meetings. The women realize this, and the women see it, but Ralph does not. And so when we look back at our definition, you can see how there is a subconscious process. Ralph is not aware of what he is doing, yet there's some internal process inside of him that is guiding him to cut women off, to allow men to speak longer, because deep down in the recesses of his subconscious mind, he believes that the work will not be effective and not be completed unless the men have a chance to talk more and talk longer. Now, I want to break down the process just a bit further so we can get a good understanding of what I mean when I talk about Ralph having some kind of motivation that he is not aware of. So our human mind is made up of three elements. Those elements are the unconscious mind, the pre-conscious mind, and then the conscious mind. Now, the unconscious mind is like a large warehouse, a huge holding area, or like a giant server that contains numerous thoughts that are akin to files or programs that operate. They operate under the surface. They're all the behind the scenes pieces that allow a computer or a cell phone or some other electronic device to run, and in our sense, it influences our mind and the way our mind operates. Now, that code or thoughts in the unconscious mind cannot be stopped, sped up, altered, or erased. So when we think about using a smartphone and we think about an application that constantly is draining our battery and there's nothing we can do about it, that is the same concept as what is going on in the unconscious mind. There's a heavy influence in the way that we think and the way that we act from the unconscious mind. Now, we have an unconscious mind, and we also have programs that operate in computers and smartphones for protection. Now, for the unconscious mind, we actually repress material. We repress material because it's a psychological safety mechanism. It's what allows us to continue to operate in the day-to-day world. It keeps us safe and allows systems to run effectively and properly, we hope, just as it does in a computer. So when you think about the gender bias that Ralph has, that gender bias is just like an unalterable program that is running in his system all the time, influencing his behaviors. Now, I'm going to say this. I don't know how I want to say this, so just give me a second. I'm going to be saying things about psychological self-protection. I'm also going to be talking about techniques about how one goes about overriding implicit bias. So it's going to appear like there's a bit of a conflict there in concept. There's really not. And the reason why there is not is because of what we refer to as the pre-conscious mind. So the pre-conscious mind is almost like a semi-permeable membrane in a cell. It allows certain things in and certain things out. It's almost like a gatekeeper. And what that gatekeeper does is looks at content and says, yes, this can come up, or no, it's going to stay down. So, and this is going to be an important factor for us. An element of what the gatekeeper does is looks at awareness. Awareness and motivation and skill. And we'll dive deeper into that as we go a little further along. Finally, there's the conscious mind. So what happens is that if something is going to bubble up from the pre-conscious that we're actually going to become aware that it's motivating our behavior, that will emerge through the pre-conscious mind and into the conscious mind. And then you have the conscious mind, which can actively make decisions and choices. I choose to behave this way, I choose not to behave this way. But that the conscious mind is really a much smaller warehouse. It is a much smaller holding station. But it is the station where we have all the freedom in the world to alter an application so it doesn't drain our battery, to rewrite the program to allow the system to function better. And when we get down in the solution section, we will see how this plays heavily into how we can actually help a potential juror identify implicit bias and the judicial system's ability to teach potential jurors about this concept and actually reduce its influence on jury decision making. Now, I know I keep picking on Ralph a little bit, and I probably will throughout the presentation, but for the sake of argument, let's say that 3 of Ralph's meetings are videotaped, because that's part of company policy for leaders to videotape meetings so they can improve leadership style. So Ralph has something in him that we call psychological readiness. Okay? So what psychological readiness is that message to the pre-conscious that it's okay for something from the unconscious mind to come forward and for the conscious mind to evaluate it and change it. And that readiness comes from certain tools that Ralph gains by being a leader. So Ralph watches the videotape. Ralph realizes that he systemically cuts off the women and allows the men to speak longer. And then Ralph has to confront inside of himself, well, I believed in gender equality, but my behavior is not showing any gender equality at all. And so Ralph then chooses to be able to change the way he behaves because of the new information that he was given. Now, there are some difficulties that I think are important to address about implicit bias, specifically because implicit bias does run in the subconscious mind and what implicit bias actually influences in us as humans. So, because for most individuals this is a subconscious process, this subconscious process is influencing how we make decisions, how we view things, our attitudes, our subsequent behaviors, and our attitudes. And if there is no mechanism that allows a person to be able to understand implicit bias and be aware of implicit bias, then that system is going to continue to operate in a way that is in the unconscious mind, influencing our behaviors and attitudes. Now, as we have advanced in science, and implicit bias has become a topic that has become very hot in a lot of arenas, what happens is that research starts to explore and examine. Whenever we talk about something that's locked deep in the unconscious mind that might influence us with no way of changing it, science is going to try and look for a way to change it. They're going to look for a way to identify it, understand it, and change it. So the first step that we need to do when it comes to this type of process is actually be able to identify what is implicit bias and identify its mechanisms. Now, Harvard University has been one of the leaders in this process, and for a very long time they have been running the Harvard University's Implicit Bias Project. They have a website that you can go to on the internet, and you can agree to participate in their ongoing study about implicit bias. And it's absolutely fascinating. I've done it myself and learned some fascinating things about certain views that I had that I did not realize that I held. And that with Harvard University, they, in their test, look at views on presidential candidates, on Senate candidates. They look at views on race, they look at views on gender, they look at views on sexual orientation. They cover the entire gamut of every arena that implicit bias can influence in the way that we think, behave, and subsequently act. Now, what science has been discovering is that they can develop measures to show where you're biased. And the measures are fascinating. Like with Harvard University, you look at your computer screen, you have 2 assigned keys that you press. So if you're looking at gender, it would say man and woman. And then when it would say man, you would press 1 key, and when it says woman, you press another. And that they would then measure the speed within which you're pressing those keys. Then halfway through the examination, the keys switch. So if man was the right key and woman was the left, they go opposite. They again show the same words. You then hit the keys again, and then they measure the time it takes for you to hit that button. And based upon time gaps, they are able to, along with a multitude of great peer-reviewed research, be able to determine where your biases exist. And that's great. It has told us so much about this process and what it means. And that it's given birth to a whole series of other measures, a lot of them time-based also, that allow us to understand where our biases are. The issue is that for a judicial system, it's just not effective. It's not effective when you call 500 people to fill courtrooms to have every single one of them take an implicit bias test. It's not time effective, it's not cost effective. So there has to be some other ways that the judicial system can use all of this valuable data that's coming out in the research. Now, it just happens to be that a researcher named Forscher et al., there were about 7 researchers altogether examining this concept, were able to come up with a study and an intervention that identified and then reduced the implicit bias in their research population within 14 days. Now, I know that 14 days can seem like a long time. All the other research studies, it's months. So this study is a breakthrough study in its system and style and ability to help identify implicit bias, be able to work with a group of people about it, and actually give them practical techniques that are proven to reduce their bias. Now, I'd like to just sort of break this down a little bit more. In their study, they did use a regular implicit bias measure, which we've just talked about as something that's impractical for a judicial system to use. Yet the other pieces of their study are practical, they are applicable, you can apply them, and because of the outcome of the study, the efficacy of this system really will not be altered all that much. So inside the study, the research participants, after they went through their implicit bias evaluation, sat down with a researcher, and that researcher explained to them how implicit bias is found, what their implicit bias was, and then specific techniques that they could use to reduce that bias. Now, there were a couple of key elements about what they did. One of the key elements of what they did when they spoke to their participants was they said, unequivocally, you can control your implicit bias and you can change it. And you can change it through motivation, you can change it through awareness, and you can change it through something that they called bias reduction strategies. Now, for us in the judicial system, the bias reduction strategies are something that would have to be altered, because their strategies were things like, over the next 14 days, if you have an implicit bias against people of color, that one strategy is to engage in a conversation with a person of color. So we really can't take a jury or a potential jury, or during a trial, send that jury out and say, go out and talk to all these people because we know what your implicit biases are. I mean, that's impractical, wouldn't work, and frankly, we wouldn't even know. So that element of it we couldn't use. But what we can use are the important concepts about awareness and motivation. Now, one of the other elements that the researchers used in this process of implicit bias, so I don't want to say this. So I think I'll strike that and I'll say this, that as the researchers conducted a 14-day post-analysis of their respondents, they actually found that most of the respondents did not really engage in or use that much these bias-reducing strategies. Yet, there was a statistically significant reduction in their implicit bias. It sort of brings up this really interesting kind of concept. And so when I looked back into the research a little bit more deeply, what I found was a two-part process. The first part was an education component about implicit bias. And what that education component was specifically about how implicit bias harms members of our community. That there are all types of groups in our society that are hurt, and sometimes hurt horribly, by implicit bias. The second component was this education and training component about what implicit bias means to them personally, and these concepts about staying motivated and staying aware of their bias. And so what seemed to have come out in the research was not so much the reduction strategies, but the focus on awareness and motivation. So I live in Colorado, and I get called for jury duty about once a year. I never get picked. I'm always sad that I don't get picked. I would love to sit on a jury. It would be a fascinating process for me. But because of my education and, of course, my training as a trial consultant, it's something that, always ends up getting me removed from a jury. But every time I'm called for jury service, in the morning, the 500 or so plus folks, we all go into one giant room, and we sit down in that room. And then a large screen, kind of like this one here, is wheeled out by the jury commissioner, and they play a video for us. And they play a video that stars the members of the Colorado State Supreme Court. And they do a stellar job of explaining the importance of jury service, the importance of the American judicial system, how it's different than most other systems in the world, and how effective it is, and how important it is for us as individuals to participate in juries. After the Supreme Court leaves, they then interview people who had served in juries in Colorado. And then you get to look watch and hear these individuals talk about how they did not want to serve on a jury, but once they got serving on a jury, how wonderful the process was, how important they felt it was, how much they felt a connection to other people and a connection to an important system in our society. The video does such an amazing job of helping jurors understand the importance of what it means to serve in a jury in the state of Colorado. Now, as I talked about a little bit earlier, that whenever you take elements from a research study and alter them, it can affect its ability to be effective. It's what we call its efficacy. And as I said before, in this study, in Forscher's study, specifically because the bias techniques, the bias reduction techniques, weren't really used all that much, and it just was motivation and awareness and education about the harm of implicit bias that seemed to be the most effective. There are some avenues that exist for the judicial system that we use right now to be able to tackle the issue of implicit bias. That first is just what I was talking about, the juror video. There's a whole section that's being missed. There's a whole opportunity that the judicial system has when they present this video and get their captive audience enamored with the process of jury service. There really is no reason in the world why those videos cannot also include information about implicit bias as part of juror education. That's the reason why we do the video. We do the video to educate the jurors, the potential jurors, of the importance of why they serve on a jury. There really is no reason why we cannot include information about what implicit bias is, how it harms members of our community, and how it can be altered. And how it can be altered by simply being aware of it and being motivated to ensure that it's not going to creep up and affect the way that we make decisions. Very important process. Very, very fascinating. Now, earlier I talked a little bit about this learn, retain, and transfer process that I used in my video. Now, this information that I garnered to develop this brief introduction of myself came from an individual named Mayer who did a lot of research about the use of multimedia, like video, as a way to educate individuals, but not just educate them in a way that the material that they gain stays with them for an extended period of time. And that's key when we talk about the video that I propose that we could use as a way to reduce implicit bias. So, oh wait, sorry, I'm going to move to my next page. My introduction is about 1 minute and 23 seconds long. I have given this opening in most every presentation I have done over the past 10 years. And there has not been a time that after a presentation is over, that there isn't around a 90% recall from the information in that video. I gave this presentation once years ago to a group of trial attorneys at about 9 o'clock in the morning. And then we went throughout the rest of the day learning about a series of different trial techniques. We went out to dinner that night, and that night, from about 7 to 9, I took a lot of ribbing about my video. And I was polite and kind about the ribbing that I was taking until one of the lawyers stood up and said, "Do you guys realize it's been about 12 hours since we've seen this video, and you have given Peter a hard time about every single slide that was in that video?" It's very telling. It's very powerful. So the learn, retain, and transfer process is incredibly important. So I want to break that down just a little bit for us. So learn, I think we all understand that relatively clearly. People need to learn. Retain, also very clear. We understand that once people learn the information, they need to retain it. The most important piece is the transfer piece. Now, The transfer piece is drawn from Gestalt psychology and derived from a term referred to as an isomorphic connection. Now, an individual named Wolfgang Kohler was the one who coined the term isomorphic connection. And that basically what he was saying was that once a person learns some information and they retain some information, that they can take that and that they can actually imprint that onto their own life experience. And then it becomes a part of their psyche, and it becomes a way that helps them operate and navigate in the world. So now we can clearly see how important an isomorphic connection is to this concept of implicit bias. Motivation, awareness, to stay on track, to be examining ourselves, to understand when we think we might be laying a bias on somebody else, that when we understand how much implicit bias harms other people, we don't want to be harmed. And I'm a firm believer that most people in society don't want to intentionally harm anybody else. And that when we have that kind of motivation, that can create an isomorphic connection with getting educated about implicit bias. From my humble opinion, I think that is the process of what occurred in this study that allowed individuals in 14 days to be able to pretty much stamp out the implicit bias that they had. That is why I believe that the ability to educate a juror, potential juror, about implicit bias and its negative effects when coupled with the importance of jury service, in my mind, is the perfect meshing to create the necessary isomorphic connection to empower a juror to understand, to be much more self-aware of what they're thinking and why. Now, there's a second part to this. We can't just show a large group of potential jurors this video and this information about implicit bias, have them end up being selected as a juror, and then entering in a trial and feeling that we've got implicit bias covered. We don't. We know this because every time a jury breaks and goes back into the jury room when there's a break, the judge offers admonishments, reminds the jury, cannot read a newspaper about the topic. You can't go to the area where this incident occurred. You can't look up concepts on the internet. You can't go into law books and look up definitions. I've heard a wide variety of admonishings, but they're all the same. What they do is that they are a reminder to the jury to stay motivated, focused, and aware not to do something that they're not supposed to do. So when we think about how we admonish a jury, the next component needs to be something about implicit bias. It needs to remind them about implicit bias. It needs to remind them of the harms of implicit bias.